My own son looked at me across that fancy table and said the words that cut deeper than any knife ever could. "Mom, you're too poor to sit with us. Look at everyone else here." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there in my simple black dress, the one I wore to church every Sunday, watching my boy. The same boy I once carried on my back to school when he was sick, treat me like I was nothing more than dirt on his expensive shoes. Around me sat women dripping in diamonds and men wearing watches that cost more than my yearly rent. But I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there as his mother. The woman who once sold her own wedding ring to buy him school books. The woman who walked 5 miles to work every day just to save bus money for his lunch. But sitting at that table, surrounded by people who smelled like money and looked at me like I was invisible, I felt like a stranger in my own son's life. The woman next to me, with her perfectly painted nails and designer purse, whispered something to her friend, and they both giggled while staring at my old shoes. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to walk away and pretend this never happened. My heart was breaking into a million pieces, but I kept my face calm. I told myself, "Don't cry, Margaret. Don't let them see you cry." I was almost ready to leave when my phone started ringing. I looked at the screen and saw a number I didn't know. Something inside me said, "Answer it," so I did. The voice on the other end said words that changed everything. "Mrs. Margaret, your business just sold for $45 million. Every fork stopped moving. Every glass stopped halfway to every mouth. Every conversation died right there. Even my son stopped talking and stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. I didn't say a word. I just sat back in my chair and smiled. Not because of the money, but because for the first time that night they were actually looking at me. They were finally seeing me as more than just the embarrassing old woman in the corner. But they had no idea what it took to get there. Welcome to Granny's Voice Stories, where we tell the truth about life that nobody wants to hear. If you've ever been pushed aside by the people you love most, if you've ever been told you're not good enough, then this story is for you. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived through more heartbreak than most people can imagine. I raised my son Tommy all by myself after his father left us when Tommy was just 7 years old. One day I was making breakfast for my little family, and the next day I was alone with a scared little boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I didn't have time to feel sorry for myself. I had to be everything to that boy. I worked at the grocery store during the day and cleaned offices at night. I wore the same coat for 6 winters and learned how to make soup from bones and vegetables that were almost too old to eat. I never bought anything new for myself. Every penny went to Tommy. When he needed new shoes, I wore mine with holes in them. When he wanted a birthday party, I saved for months to make it special. I told him every night that we were rich in love, and he believed me. When Tommy got into college, I cried in the bathroom at work because I didn't know how to pay for it. But I found a way. I borrowed money from everyone I knew. I worked 3 jobs. I sold everything I owned except the bed and the kitchen table. When he graduated, I was the proudest mother in the world. I clapped until my hands hurt. But after that day something changed. The phone calls got shorter. The visits stopped. I became like a shadow in his new, shiny life. But I never stopped loving him. I never stopped hoping he would remember who raised him. Tommy was always a smart boy. Even as a little kid, he could talk his way out of trouble and make people smile. Teachers loved him. Neighbors praised him. When he was 10, he built a robot from old boxes and won first place at the school science fair. I still remember how he looked at me with that blue ribbon in his hand, grinning like he had conquered the world. "We did it, Mom," he said. And I believed him because back then we were a team. I saved every dollar I could find for his future. I packed his lunch with little notes that said, "Be brave today," and "I believe in you." When it was time for college, I did whatever it took. I signed papers I barely understood because his dreams were my dreams too. When he got his first job in the big city, he called me from the street corner. "Mom, I made it," he said. I stayed on the phone with him for 2 hours, just listening to his voice and feeling proud. I used part of my retirement money to help him buy his first car. Nothing fancy, just something reliable. And on his wedding day, I wore my best dress and sat in the front row, trying not to cry because I was so happy for him. At his wedding, I gave him an envelope with enough money to help them buy their first house. He hugged me so tight and said, "Mom, I'll never forget this. I'll always take care of you." I believed him. I thought I would always have a place in his heart, no matter how successful he became. But time changed everything. The calls became less frequent. The visits stopped completely. The warm voice that used to say, "Love you, Mom," became cold and distant. He never said it directly, but I felt it. Success had filled his life with everything except room for me. The invitation to his 40th birthday party came in the mail 2 weeks before the event. Just a fancy card with gold writing, stuck between bills and junk mail. No phone call, no personal note, just an address to some expensive restaurant I'd never heard of. But I went anyway. Course I did. I put on my best dress, navy blue with little flowers, and pressed it the night before. I made him a photo album with pictures from when he was little, with a letter I wrote him years ago but never had the courage to give him. I arrived 15 minutes early, holding my homemade gift and feeling nervous. The restaurant was like something from a movie. Crystal lights everywhere, soft music playing, and the smell of expensive food in the air. Everyone looked rich. The women wore dresses that probably cost more than my car, and the men had watches that sparkled under the lights. I found Tommy near the bar, laughing with some man in a suit. I walked over and touched his arm gently. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. He turned around and his smile disappeared. "Oh, Mom," he said. "You came." No hug, no warmth, just a quick look from my shoes to my hair like he was checking for damage. I handed him the photo album. He looked at it confused. "You didn't need to bring anything," he said. Then his wife walked over. She smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. She looked at my purse and said, "That's interesting." I nodded politely. "It served me well," I said. From the corner of my eye, I saw 2 women pointing at me and whispering. One of them laughed and covered her mouth. I heard pieces of what they said. "Is that his mother? She looks so ordinary." They giggled behind their wine glasses. I found a seat at the far end of the long table and placed my gift beside my plate. The waiter walked past me 3 times before I had to ask for water. Around me everything sparkled. Gold plates, fresh flowers, tall candles. It was like a fairy tale, except I was the character who didn't belong. Tommy barely looked at me all night. No introduction, no acknowledgement, no mention that I was the reason he was even alive. When he stood up to give his thank you speech, I waited to hear my name. I listened to every word as he thanked his colleagues, his wife, her parents, his friends. But he never said it. Not once. Not even a tiny mention of the woman who held his hand through nightmares and sickness and scared moments. I sat there with my hands folded, feeling something inside me go quiet. It wasn't anger or even sadness. It was the sound of giving up. The sound of finally understanding that I had been erased from his story. As everyone clapped and raised their glasses, I realized that Tommy didn't just leave me behind. He pretended I never existed. The weight of that truth settled in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. I looked around that table at all the people cheering for him like he built his life all by himself. Like he was self-made and didn't need anyone's help. Like I wasn't sitting right there in front of them. They laughed and clinked glasses while I sat invisible. I told myself to just stay quiet and get through the rest of the night. But there was a small voice inside me that whispered, "Say something. Remind him who you are." So when the noise died down and people went back to eating and talking, I stood up slowly. Nobody noticed at first. It wasn't like when Tommy spoke. The room didn't go quiet for me. I cleared my throat gently and tapped my spoon against my glass. "I just wanted to say something," I said softly. But Tommy's voice cut through mine like a sword. "Mom," he said sharply, and now the room went quiet. "Please don't. You're embarrassing everyone." Froze. My mouth was still open, my hand still holding the spoon. He didn't stop there. Maybe if you were more like these other women, more put together, you wouldn't always make things so awkward. A few people laughed under their breath. His wife looked away, smiling into her wine glass. I stood there blinking, not believing what I was hearing. This was the same boy I carried when he was sick, the same boy I sang to when he had bad dreams. Now he was standing in front of strangers, acting like I was nothing more than an embarrassment. He turned back to his friends like nothing happened. The conversation started again. Someone finally poured me a glass of water like they felt sorry for me. Then I heard it, soft but clear enough to hurt me. A woman down the table said, "Maybe she should have just stayed home." The man next to her laughed. "You'd think she'd know better by now." And then Tommy, my own son, leaned back in his chair and said the words that broke my heart completely. "She's too poor to sit with us anyway." The laughter got louder, sharp and cold and mean. The kind of laughter that comes from people who think they're better than you. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't move because something inside me had already broken. And just as I was about to pick up my purse and leave forever, my phone rang. And with that one call, everything changed. The same table that mocked me was about to learn who I really was. I looked at my phone screen. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it. "Mrs. Margaret," the voice said clearly and professionally. "I'm calling with wonderful news. Your online business just sold for $45 million. I didn't say anything at first. Couldn't. But right then, something magical happened. The woman who was about to take another bite of her expensive food stopped with her fork in the air. The man who was drinking wine put his glass down without taking a sip. Tommy's wife stopped laughing and her mouth fell open. It was like someone had pressed a pause button on the entire room. I slowly stood up, not to make a scene, but because I was ready to go home. But now everyone was staring at me. Tommy looked confused and maybe a little scared. "Mom?" he asked, and his voice didn't sound mean anymore. I put my phone back in my purse and picked up the photo album that no one had bothered to look at. As I walked toward the door, I passed the same women who had whispered about my clothes and my purse. Their eyes followed me now, wide and surprised. One of them whispered, "$45 million, to the other like she couldn't believe it was real. Tommy just sat there watching me like he'd never seen me before. Like I was a stranger in a story he didn't write. His mouth was open like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. For the first time all night, he had nothing to say. And it felt wonderful. The same table that laughed at me, ignored me, and made me feel small was now frozen in silence. Their expensive clothes suddenly looked ordinary. Their jewelry suddenly looked cheap. Their loud voices were finally quiet. I didn't smile to be mean. I smiled because I had remembered my own worth. And now they could see it too. They thought they were better than me, but they were just louder. And when the room finally went quiet, it wasn't because I demanded it. It was because truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. By the time they finally saw me for who I really was, I had already built a life they couldn't even imagine. What they never knew, what Tommy never cared to ask, was what happened after he left home. After the wedding, after the housewarming party, after all the "thank you mom" messages followed by silence. While they were building their shiny lives and impressing their fancy friends, I was quietly building something of my own. I didn't waste time crying about being forgotten. I didn't beg for phone calls or try to guilt them into visiting. Instead, I used that silence to build something beautiful. I had always been good with money. Even when I was counting pennies to pay rent, I knew how to make every dollar stretch. After Tommy moved out and the house felt too empty, I started doing bookkeeping for small businesses around town. Flower shops, restaurants, repair shops. Nothing fancy but honest work. When I finally saved enough money, I did something that surprised even me. I started learning about the internet and computers. I spent nights watching videos about how to start online businesses. I printed out articles about making money on the internet and studied them like they were textbooks. I learned about selling things online, about websites, about reaching customers all over the world. It wasn't easy for a woman my age, but I was determined. I started small, selling handmade crafts and vintage items I found at garage sales. I learned how to take pictures, how to write descriptions, how to ship packages. Slowly, very slowly, my little online shop started to grow. People loved the care I put into every item. My business grew from selling a few items a week to selling hundreds. I hired other women to help me find unique pieces and craft beautiful things. We became a team of grandmothers and mothers who understood quality and care. What started as a way to fill my empty hours became something amazing. My online shop became famous for finding the most beautiful vintage treasures and handmade gifts. Customers from all over the world began buying from us. And last month, a big company offered to buy my business for $45 million. Said yes. While Tommy was posting pictures of his expensive dinners and fancy vacations, I was building an empire with my own two hands. While his friends were bragging about their jobs and their money, I was quietly becoming richer than all of them combined. But I never told anyone. Not Tommy, not his wife, not the people who thought I was just a sad old woman. I let them think I stayed small while I was actually growing bigger than they could ever imagine. Sometimes the best kind of power is the kind you don't show off. The kind you build in silence while the world ignores you. Standing in that restaurant where I had just been laughed at and pushed aside, I held something none of them had. Real power. Quiet strength. The phone call was over, but the words $45 million still hung in the air like perfume. I didn't need to repeat it. I didn't need to give a speech. The room that had been full of laughter and clinking glasses was now a museum of shocked faces. Tommy was the first to speak, but his voice was different now. Smaller, younger, like the little boy who used to ask me to check for monsters under his bed. Wait, Mom, what business? When did you start selling things online? His wife's fake smile came back, but this time it was desperate. You never mentioned you were an entrepreneur, she said, suddenly touching my arm like we were best friends. The same women who whispered about my purse were now leaning forward, asking about my business secrets, telling me they always knew I was special. I said nothing because their interest wasn't real. They didn't care about me, they cared about my money. They hadn't changed, just the numbers had. A man at the end of the table, the same one who laughed when Tommy insulted me, raised his glass and said, "Well, Margaret, you're the richest woman in the room now." I looked him straight in the eye and said calmly, "I always was." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the silence of shame. It was the silence of understanding. I picked up my purse, the same thrift store purse they had mocked, and held it with pride. Because now they would never look at it the same way. Not because it had changed, but because I had shown them who I really was. Tommy stepped closer like he wanted to say something, but I held up my hand gently. Not to silence him, but to say goodbye. I didn't owe them explanations. I didn't owe them my story. Not anymore. I walked past the table where I had once sat invisible, and every head turned to watch me go. Not because of what I wore, but because of what they finally saw. A woman they could never dismiss again. I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. I let the silence speak for me, and then I walked out of that glass tower restaurant with my head high and my heart whole. The photo album was still tucked under my arm, the gift no one had opened. That night, I slept with the kind of peace that comes when you stop begging for a seat at someone else's table and build your own instead. But the next morning my phone rang again. This time it was Tommy. I saw his name on the screen and thought about all the different versions of him I had known. The baby who cried when I left the room. The teenager who called me before every test. The man who had just broken my heart in public. Answered. "Mom," he said, and his voice was soft now, like a child again. "Mom, I'm sorry about last night. I didn't mean what I said. Love you. I was just nervous with all those people watching, and you look so out of place. Even in his apology, he was still blaming me for existing. I let him talk. I let him make excuses and give reasons why my presence was embarrassing. And then, like I knew he would, he got to the real reason for his call. "Actually, Mom, there's something I wanted to ask you. I'm working on a new business project, and we're looking for investors. Since you're doing so well financially now, I thought maybe you'd want to help us out. It could be really profitable for both of us." There it was. He didn't call because he missed me. He called because my bank account was suddenly more valuable than my love had ever been. I took a deep breath and said in the calmest voice I could manage, "Tommy, you didn't want me as your mother last night. Don't ask me to be your banker today." The phone went quiet. I could hear him breathing, could feel his shock through the silence. He mumbled something about not meaning it that way, about wanting to reconnect, but I was done listening to words that only came after wealth. "I hope your business does well, son," I said simply. "But I'm not your investor." Then I hung up. Not out of anger but out of peace. Because I had finally stopped trying to prove my worth to someone who only saw dollar signs. These days, I don't go to fancy restaurants or sit at tables where laughter cuts like broken glass. I sit on my back porch with a cup of tea and watch the flowers I planted with my own hands. The same hands that once wiped Tommy's tears. The same hands that worked 3 jobs to pay for his dreams. I sit in my favorite chair and watch the world without needing anything from it. Because I've learned the hardest lesson of all. How to let go. I don't think about that dinner anymore. I don't wonder what would have happened if Tommy had been proud of me instead of ashamed. Some questions don't need answers. Time teaches us that holding grudges is like carrying rocks in your pockets. It only weighs you down. I'm not bitter. I'm just done explaining myself to people who never really wanted to understand. If you've ever been told you don't belong, if you've ever been made to feel too small or too ordinary, remember this. Your worth was never in their eyes. It was in the life you built when nobody was watching. You don't need their table to be complete. Build your own and make it beautiful.